Thank you very much for coming to this session. I know it is a time of fasting and everybody is tired or half sleepy, and it is the session is later than the normal schedule of this gatherings. So I'm very grateful for those of you who have so much commitment and love for meeting each other that you have come here. In the last 4 sessions that we had various discussions, I focused mostly on the writings of the Bab. Some aspects of his writings in the context of the time and the historical situation that he found himself there. From today, we are going to concentrate a little bit on the writings of Baha'u'llah and put that also a little bit in the context of the situation, local, national, and global situation that he was located at the time. But I'm going to make today a session, introductory session, namely to discuss some introductory remarks which paves the way for next sessions to discuss more directly some of the writings of Baha'u'llah and some of the worldviews offered through these writings. What I want to discuss today, and briefly because I know that today we have to be more concise and I can't continue just talking and talking. In the limited time that I'm going to share things with you, I'm going to talk about the character of Baha'u'llah and a glimpse of his worldview, of his sentiments prior to his mission as a Babi first, and then as the founder of the Baha'i faith. What we know of Baha'u'llah, of course, is that first he becomes a Babi in the same year that the Bab declares his mission, 1844. He joins the Babi community and he becomes very active, and he was one of the major leaders of the Babi community. And then in 1852, he has particular experiences, and through that, Baha'i faith is born, and his mission as the founder of Baha'i faith, a new spiritual civilization, starts. But it is important to know something about character and sentiments, forms of approach to the world prior to these times, when he's a child, when he's young. And I think this is very important. Not only it gives us a much better view of Baha'u'llah and his message and so on, but also historically it is very useful. Namely, it's always a curious question that the source of Baha'u'llah's ideas, because his message and his worldview was so diametrically different from traditional conception of religion. Because of that qualitative difference, in a sense, a complete transformation and revolution that you find in his worldview and in his writing, in his messages and so on, it's also always an important question that what were the sources which affected Baha'u'llah's ideas, bringing all these new, completely revolutionary ideas, breaking with the past, with all religious traditions of the past. And to know something about Baha'u'llah's childhood, when he was a young man, his sentiments, his character, his approach, his worldview during those times can be directly and significantly helpful for locating Baha'u'llah in terms of this question, namely the origins of his thought and so on. Fortunately, there are a number of documents, many of them testimonies by Baha'u'llah himself. One of them, at least, one of his writings, which gives us a very meaningful glimpse of his character, his orientation to the world, his values, and the like. So I'm going to share with you 4 of these and try to be very brief. The first one is a story that Baha'u'llah tells us about what happened to him as an experience in his childhood. He says, during his tofuliyat, his childhood. This is one of the most important glimpses for understanding the worldview of Baha'u'llah and also his character. What he says in one of his writings is that when he was a child, as I mentioned, during his tofuliyat, that he read in a book which he says it's attributed to the author Majlisi, the story of event that happened, the episode of Bani Qurayza. And he says that after reading that, he became extremely sad. He describes that he went into depression and that for many days this continued. And he says that during those times I was conversing with God, praying to God, and asking God, beseeching God that this culture would be replaced by another culture of love and unity. Then he says that during those same times, so these are all happening in the childhood of Baha'u'llah, not later on in 1852. He says that on the day of his birthday, before the dawn, very early in the morning, Baha'u'llah says that he had a particular experience which transformed his being, which gave him the glad tidings of ascent, Besharat Uruj. And he says that this continued for 12 days, and then he became extremely happy, and this became the source of the ideas that he brought during his future revelation, principles of unity of all religions, unity of all humankind, rejection of violence, emphasis on communication and fellowship and friendship with all groups, from all religions, from all ethnic groups, and the like. And of course, the notion of equality of the right of all people, and a new conception of religion, when religion becomes a source of love and unity and communication, interaction, friendship, rather than a source of conflict avoidance and break of communication. So this particular episode that he's talking about clearly is extremely formative of his personality, of his worldview. It plays a central role in the birth of the Baha'i faith in the future. What is this Bani Qurayza episode? Many of you might know that. This is an event which is discussed extensively by Muslim historians in their books. And it relates to a Jewish tribe whose name was Bani Qurayza, or Bani Qurayza, and they had tensions like the other Jewish tribes of Medina with Prophet Muhammad. Medina was a place in which there was a very significant presence of Jewish faith in the city of Medina. Out of the 8 tribes, 3 of them were Jewish. So there were some confrontations, and in the first confrontations, 2 of the Jewish tribes were ordered to be expelled from Medina by the order of Prophet Muhammad. And then there was this confrontation with the 3rd Jewish tribe, which is Bani Qurayza. And they had sympathies with Meccan people who were opposed to Prophet Muhammad. And in a particular military confrontation, they had sympathies with the Meccan people, but the Meccan people came and surrounded Medina. But by digging ditches in a battle which is famous as Battle of Ditches or Khandaq, the Meccan people could not do anything really and eventually left and returned to Mecca. After that, the Islamic army comes and surrounds this Jewish tribe, Bani Qurayza, and after a few days of besiegement, they decide to surrender themselves to the Islamic army. And then the question was, what should be the punishment for them? And they decide that a Jewish convert to Islam, he would decide, and whatever he decides, that would be the punishment for this Jewish tribe. And that person says that all the males, all the Jewish males should be killed, should be beheaded, and all the females and all the children should become slaves of the Muslims, of the Islamic army. And this is confirmed by Prophet Muhammad according to this story, and therefore all the males are killed. The histories talk, some of them, that it was 750, some of them talk about 800. And all the females and children are taken as slaves and captives for the Muslims. They are distributed among them. This is a story that varieties of Muslim sources have discussed it. Actually, it does not exist within any Jewish sources. None of the Jewish sources and history among Jewish literature and so on talk about an event like this, but Muslim sources have discussed this with pride frequently, and it is part of the literature. This is the story that Baha'u'llah read when he was a child in the book of Majlisi. Majlisi is this very important figure of the Shia Islam during the Safavid period, and he had immense power, political power. In any case, so Baha'u'llah says that by reading this story, he became very depressed, and this depression continued. He says that no tongue can describe his sadness, and that he was asking God for compassion, for mercy, for unity, and the like. And then he says that on his birthday, and he specifies the time at dawn that he had this experience, which continued for 12 days. And from then on, his depression was replaced by joy and delight and happiness and so on. And the glad tidings of ascent that he had was fulfillment of the desire that he had, namely that religion is going to become from now on a source of not violence, not avoidance, but a source of equality, of love, of affirmation of human rights, of communication, of friendship, fellowship, and the like. So, looking at this episode and at this event described by Baha'u'llah himself, you can have a very significant and very meaningful picture of Baha'u'llah's character, his sentiments, his orientation to the world, and so on, from his childhood. This is the age of Tufuliyat. The other story that I want to share with you, I'll go back and forth in time, is an event which relates to the youth of Baha'u'llah. This is when Baha'u'llah was 22 years of age. When Baha'u'llah was 22 years old, his father, Mirza Buzurg Nuri, who was one of the great aristocratic figures in Iran with connections to the Qajar court, passes away. That's in 1839. This is the time that his father dies. And Baha'u'llah becomes the head of the entire family. According to the descriptions that Abdul Baha has given us, we know that a number of things start to happen here, and one of them is that Baha'u'llah frees different slaves in the household of his father. Namely, in the household of Mirza Buzurg Nuri, there were a number of slaves, a number of them from African descent, and Baha'u'llah frees them. Last winter, not this winter, which we are almost at the end of it, although in Los Angeles it's hard to remember when it's winter and when it's not. My wife and I, we were in Minnesota before coming to Los Angeles 8 months ago, and winter was nothing that could be forgotten or confused or mistaken with anything else. It has a very distinctive presence. In any case, in the previous winter, namely about 15 months ago, I was in Haifa and I was working on the writings of Baha'u'llah, which exists in the Baha'i archive in Haifa, helping for inventory of these writings and also to do indexing, computer indexing of the content of these different tablets and so on. Vast majority of these tablets have never been published, either in Persian or in Arabic, let alone to be translated. Neither they are translated nor available, published in Persian or its Arabic original. Some of them are published and some of them are translated, but majority are not. And during this time, I found a number of tablets of Baha'u'llah which were extremely significant and important in terms of varieties of issues and questions. Tablets that nobody has noted them, so they have never been discussed anywhere, and the Baha'i community is not aware of their existence. So one of these tablets, I found actually two tablets in which Baha'u'llah is writing in the form of prayer the description of this event in 1839, namely that he is setting free the slaves of the households of his father. So I translated one of these tablets into English. It's my translation, so there is nothing authorized or formal about it, but it gives you the basic idea. So it's in the form of a prayer. Baha'u'llah is engaged in a prayer. He's addressing God. He's talking to God in order to convey to us what is happening at that moment. So this is a very important document. As far as I know, this is the first writing of Baha'u'llah that we have. Previously, we used to think that the first writing of Baha'u'llah that we have is his Qasideh Rashi Ama, which is a poem, a mystic poem, sprinkles from the cloud of Ama, which Ama is a very complicated mystical concept. And there is debate whether it was that particular poem was written in the Tehran prison in 1852 or a few years before that. There are some debates, and it's not really settled completely, the issue. But that's normally the work that we think is the first work of Baha'u'llah that we have. But this work that now I'm sharing with you is written in 1839. This is 5 years before even the Bab would declare his cause. So it has nothing to do with the cause of the Bab. So historically, it's an extremely important text in terms of the history of Baha'i faith, in terms of the life of Baha'u'llah, and in terms of the life of Iran and the Middle East, and in terms of the life of the world. Remember, it is 1839. It's at a time that slavery was legal and prevalent in most parts of the world that became the centers later on for fighting against slavery. So I'm going to read for you this prayer. Remember his prayer. He's talking to God of Baha'u'llah, and he's 22 years old. He just has become the head of the family, and one of the first things that he's doing is he's setting the slave free. Most likely, the person that he's talking about here is Esfandiar, and he was an African slave in the household of Baha'u'llah, and Baha'u'llah is describing the interaction between him and Esfandiar. Sanctified art thou, O my God. At this moment, one slave is standing before another slave and seeks from him his freedom. Yet his owner is himself not but a slave for thee, a servant in your threshold, and absolute nothingness before the manifestations of your lordship. Standing before thee, I bear witness at this very moment to that which thou hast testified by yourself for yourself, that verily thou art God, and there is none other God but thee. All mighty kings are mere slaves before the gate of your grace, and all the wealthy are the essence of poverty in the shore of your holy dominion. And all the exalted are abject lowliness within the glorified court of your bounty. Notwithstanding this, how then can this slave claim for himself ownership of any other human being? Nay, his existence is a mere crime graver than any sin in your kingdom. And now, O my God, since that servant has asked from this servant his freedom, therefore I call thee to witness at this moment that I am setting him free in your path, liberating him in your name, and emancipating his neck from the chain of servitude, so that he may serve thee in the daytime and in the night season, longing that my neck would never be relieved from the cord of your servitude. This verily is my most cherished desire and my supreme end. This is an unbelievable document. Not only the prayer is so powerful, so beautiful, but also, historically speaking, this is a turning point in the history of the world and in the history of the Middle East. The question of slavery in the Middle East, including in Iran, has been researched and has been historically documented. It was a very prevalent institution in Iran and in all the Islamic societies. Many of the major Islamic cities have been centers of slave trade and slave traffic. Mecca, Medina, Damascus, Baghdad, and the like. They have been major centers of slave trade for centuries. And slavery has been different. It had different patterns in the Islamic societies as compared to the West. Many of these forms of slavery predate the forms of slavery in the West, but also it continues later on. And in some ways, slavery has been more humane as compared to some of the practices and expressions of that in the West. At some points, it is even more cruel because many of these slaves were used as domestic servants, and for that reason, they had to be castrated. And because the two, a male and female who are not related, in some ways they cannot be in the same place according to the Islamic laws of the time. And so these slaves had to be kidnapped when they were children because they would not survive the operation later on. And in the Lower Egypt, it was a place that this castration would take place. Out of 4, 3 would die. And one of them would survive and would be taken as a slave. But once they were in slavery, they were treated more humanly, and some of them were used for army, and those who were used in army, if they showed courage and so on, they could have advancement, military advancement, and some of them became very powerful figures in the history of the Middle East. Slavery became illegal in Iran itself at the end of 1920s, if I remember 1929. And in many other parts of the Middle East much later. Saudi Arabia outlawed slavery in 1962, despite vehement opposition of the ulama, of the religious leaders, who wrote this joint decree, and they said that what God has made lawful, no human being can make it unlawful. But because of the pressure, international pressure and so on, it became legally abolished. We are now talking about 1839. A young man who just became the head of the family of 22 years age, that same person who in his childhood goes into absolute depression upon awareness of what has happened in Bani Qurayza and his longing, this existential longing for unity and communication and human rights, and the fact that religion becomes a cause of love and concord and harmony in the world and not violence. So regardless of the fact that one believes in religion or not, one believes in baha'u'llah in any form or shape or not, looking at this particular event and document and so on, all Iranians in particular should be so proud of having an Iranian, a Persian, by the name Mirza Hussein Ali, who is called later on Baha'u'llah, as one of their fellow countrymen whose vision was like this. Now, if you paid attention to the content of this tablet, Baha'u'llah not only is setting free a particular slave, he is giving a philosophical, sociological reason why slavery in principle is incorrect and metaphysically also impossible. Namely, that all human beings are nothing because they are servants and slaves of God, but because of that relation to God, being mirrors of God and all creation of God, for that reason all are supreme and sacred and all are equal. And for that reason, the servitude in relation to God defines the nobility and the sanctity of all humans. And for that reason, slavery is impossible and unjustifiable in any form or shape. It is very interesting that later on, Baha'u'llah, in his most holy book, which was written in 1873, formally abrogates slavery, and the argument that he mentions in Kitab Aqdas, the most holy book, is exactly the same thing. He says that all are slaves of God, and for that reason nobody can buy or sell another human being. Nobody can own another human being. Because of our servitude, common servitude of all of us to God, that nothingness of us makes all of us noble and sanctified and endowed with all rights. Prior to that, in 1868, when he writes to leaders of the world, among the points that he makes, for example, in his letter to Queen Victoria of England, Baha'u'llah praises the emerging policies in England, which were moving towards the abolition of a slave trade and a slave traffic. And Baha'u'llah says that this is the will of God, the abolition of slavery. But it is very interesting that that same argument is present in this probably first work of Baha'u'llah that we have. And it is an absolutely mesmerizing work. I haven't brought the original. The original one is in Arabic. You noted that the language of Baha'u'llah was language of servitude. It's very different from the language that he has after 1852, when he is now a manifestation of God and he's the founder of the Baha'i faith. Then he writes usually with much more higher sovereignty and majesty, his language. The language here is utter language of servitude in general. But that's because this is even before he becomes a Babi. So this document, this is no longer his own description. This is a work of Baha'u'llah that we have, and I found another tablet which is written at the same time. This one is setting free a female slave. And definitely we know the name of that because the tablet indicates the name of the female slave, which is in my notes, but I don't have it with me. The third element that I want to share with you is his description of a particular experience when he was a child, and the impression that experience had in his mind. This is discussed in his letter to the Grand Vizier of Ottoman Empire, Ali Pasha. It's a tablet known normally as Loh Reis, the tablet of Reis, which refers to the Ottoman authority. And within that, written around 1868, within that, Baha'u'llah is telling this person that he should not be so proud in terms of the temporal power that he has. That if he opens his mind and broadens his horizon, he would understand that the real nobility is in servitude to God, and therefore he would not be so much obsessed with this, and therefore he would not act in tyranny and oppression and injustice towards people. In order to convey that message, Baha'u'llah talks about a story related to his childhood. He says that one of his relatives was going to get married, and so they had this wedding, very elaborate forms of wedding. And he was a child, and he attended that wedding. And among things that he says is that they had a puppet show within that wedding, and the puppet show he describes was the story of military confrontations between two groups of people. I don't remember the details of that particular subject. And that, a group of people come and soldiers come and they kill each other, and some are taken as captive, and then they come and they are beheaded, and there are all these different expressions of might and power and glory and the like and so on. And Baha'u'llah says that he was watching this puppet show, and he was very amused. And then he says later on he saw a person having a box with him that he was leaving, and he talks with this person, and he was the person who was in charge of this puppet show. And he tells Baha'u'llah, do you know where all those kings and their glory and their might and their throne and those soldiers and power and all these things have gone? Baha'u'llah was eager to know, and he says that they are all now in this box. This is the story that happened. The rest of that from here, which is very little, of course, is very important because it shows the interpretation which this particular experience, the interpretation which is made in the mind of Baha'u'llah. So it gives you a clue about the sentiment of Baha'u'llah and the operations of his mind. And what he says is that he noted at that very moment that all these manifestations of wealth and power and glory and all these obsessions with these material symbols and so on, they have no value. They are all shadows, because all of us and all the people with all material and military and political possessions, powers, and so on, we all would go into the box of the grave. We all die, and we all would return to this nothingness. And he says that from then on he learned that, he noted that he should be detached from the world, and he should not be longing, yearning, and desiring power and dominion over others and the like. This is also a very important element for understanding the character of Baha'u'llah. and it fits exactly with the later developments in the life of Baha'u'llah. As I would discuss in the next session, which would be it won't be introduction anymore, the very beginning and emergence and logic of Baha'i faith was to transform this concept of millenarianism and to replace what normally was understood as divine will in terms of oppression and killing and murder and genocide and violence and so on. He turned that all into its opposite. And so millenarianism became an expression of freedom of conscience, of removal of the sword, of rejection of all kinds of implications of the law of holy war, of jihad or qital. And one of the implications of that of course was separation of church and state. That Baha'u'llah constantly affirms that religion belongs to the realm of the heart. This is the realm that God wants to have sovereignty over it. And the earth's dominion over the earth becomes the realm of politics, and coercion becomes relevant as part of that dominion over earth. But in the realm of the dominion over heart, nothing but voluntary acceptance and persuasion of the heart can be justification of belief. So he himself frequently says that he has absolutely no desire for assuming any temporal political position or power and so on. It's very interesting that he defines the concept of maturation of humanity, which I have to deal with these things in future lectures, what I call it as the birth of the human being as human being to appear on this earth. He defines this maturation of humanity, that we attain the age of reason, among other things, as the culture in which kingship, absolute kingship, would be there, and no one would have any desire to approach it. Namely, the thirst for domination, the thirst for power would be replaced with the culture of servitude and communication and so on. In a document that we have of a conversation between Baha'u'llah and some of the Qajar officials and nobles who came to visit Baha'u'llah while he was in Baghdad. I'll talk about Baghdad hopefully in my next session. But we have a record of that conversation, and Baha'u'llah talks of 5 treasures, 5 cans. And the first of these 5 is this idea that those who are mystically advanced and have spiritual development and so on, they in any form or shape are avoiding assuming dominion and control and power and so on. So Baha'u'llah defines the emergence of human being, reason, maturation, and so on, in terms of this particular attitude to power. If you compare that to what Nietzsche would say, that he would define the whole reality, including reality of human beings, as the will to power, Baha'u'llah defines that will to power as an expression of immaturity of human being, that we are still captives of the world of nature. And that when we emerge as a spirit, then it would be consciousness and awareness of unity, of harmony, of fellowship, and not desire for domination. In any case, I'll finish at this time everybody needs to go home and become ready. Those of you who are going to fast tomorrow for another fasting. But these 3 episodes, 3 events that I mentioned regarding the life of Baha'u'llah, long time before declaration of the Bab, either in the childhood of Baha'u'llah or when he was a young man, gives us a very good indication of his character, something which is absolutely consistent and harmonious with his future message and his future ideas, and would give us better information, really, about the sources and inspirations for his future writings and his future ideas and his future principles and so on. We are dealing with an unusual human being here whose central orientation to life was from that very beginning principle of love. Love was appears from all these things to be the essence of his character, of his sentiments, and his existential mode of interaction and communication and perception of the world. And these become the operative principles of the message that he's going to share with us. During the next 3 sessions, I'm going to emphasize his various writings and a message which is rooted partly in these experiences that I shared with you. If there are any questions, this is a good time. Yes?
Could you say that poem, prayer, was in Arabic?
Yes, it's in Arabic.
Oh, it's okay. They want me to say it again. You said that it was in Arabic.
Yes, the original of this prayer is in Arabic. And it's a very beautiful prayer. I wish I had brought that and I could read it. But most of you probably don't know Arabic, so this translation would be sufficing for this session. But it's the only difference with future writings of Baha'u'llah. The style is similar. You can tell that this is Baha'u'llah. But the only major difference is that the language is extremely language of servitude, which is not the normal, typical language of Baha'u'llah. Later on, his language is always language of sovereignty and might and power and so on. This is extraordinary language of servitude. Yes?
Do you know what happened to the slave, Esfandiar?
Yes, fortunately we know about Esfandiar. Esfandiar remained with the household of Baha'u'llah, and so he continued to be a servant, and he was very trusted and intimate. So we know, for instance, that in 1852, when Baha'u'llah is taken and he's taken into prison and so on, Esfandiar remained faithful with the family of Baha'u'llah, and that he was subject to lots of persecutions for that reason in the streets of Tehran and so on. So Abdul Baha has said a number of things about this Esfandiar, his loyalty and his faith, and he's praised in glowing terms in the writings of Abdul Baha. Well, Abdul Baha knew him personally. Yes?
I was taught that manifestations of God are really a separate class. It's not something that one could evolve into. Is there anything that you have studied where Baha'u'llah has the awareness of being a manifestation of God before he actually declares it or has the experience in the Siyachal?
Well, this question is really a metaphysical question, and So you can look at, for example, the documents or episodes that I shared with you and interpret that and conclude that this means that Baha'u'llah had from the very beginning a prophetic consciousness, that he was actually a prophet. Later on he declares that, but he already was that. This is a very plausible form of reading of these documents. But also you can believe that he had this claim of prophetic consciousness and so on in the future, and these are earlier stages of development of a personality, which is in that same in terms of that same logic and compatible with that same worldview, but not completely developed it. Both are possible. I mean, both readings are possible. Unfortunately, we don't have that much writings of Baha'u'llah available, or documents of Baha'u'llah available, belonging to earlier times of Baha'u'llah. I should say, however, I should modify what I said. I haven't seen and I haven't studied all the writings of Baha'u'llah. When I was in Haifa working on in Baha'i archives on the writings of Baha'u'llah, we were there for about 2.5 months. But because I had to engage in indexing, which means each paragraph of each tablet, I had to tag it in terms of different subjects. So I couldn't just read fast and then write a summary and things like that. So although I worked extremely hard, I mean, I slept when I would pass out, more or less. I mean, not pass away, pass out. Although pass away is not also inappropriate, because it was an unusual experience, spiritual experience, reading these works of Baha'u'llah, and life and death would merge together. In any case, despite all this, I could read only 15% of the writings of Baha'u'llah. And I found lots of tablets of Baha'u'llah, lots of documents, things like what I shared with you tonight, which are extremely important and clarify so many issues in terms of Baha'u'llah and his messages and so on. So I haven't read vast majority of the writings of Baha'u'llah yet. So it is possible that within those that I have not read yet, there would be a number of texts which are written during his earlier times. Then our understanding might be different. But at this time, based upon what I know, we have few of the writings of Baha'u'llah available prior to his experience in Tehran dungeon, and the beginning of writing varieties of works beginning in 1853.
Thank you. Still a mystery.
Yes.
Dr. Said, thank you so much. This is so amazing and exciting to hear these stories. The last story of the 3 stories that you told us, the last story of Baha'is,
Yes.
of course, translated into English. We know where it is. But the first 2 stories, are there actually in print? Is there a reference, or you're just relying on the studies that you did in the archives?
The first one is in one of the tablets of Baha'u'llah, which have been published. I mean, it's original, which is in Persian. And I remember in the book that I wrote a long time ago called Logos and Civilization, which was about the writings of Baha'u'llah, I translated those parts which are related to this in Logos and Civilization. But I noted that in one of the Ruhi books also, this story is discussed briefly, but it is discussed. So how much it is translated, I don't know. I don't know if it is part of the authorized translations available in the form of Baha'i translations or not, but the original of this tablet is present, is written, it is in Ma'ideh, it is in Asrarul Asar, and other places. And in English, as I mentioned, within Logos and Civilization, I have translated, and then some of that I have paraphrased the basic ideas of the first one. The second one, this one, I mean, you are the only large group that I'm sharing this. And it was among the tablets of Baha'u'llah, which is there, which is untouched. Nobody really have worked with them. Nobody have perhaps noted them. I shared this with my class. Was it this term? Yeah, I think this term. Because I thought that it's an academic course on this present course. It's called Babi Baha'i Text. And so I thought that this is an important, relevant document that they should, and it is for that reason that I translated it, because I wanted to share with my class in UCLA. But other than that, my wife Bita loves this prayer, and so she talks about it in different places with different friends. So a few others have heard of this, but in principle, you are the first people who become aware of the existence of such a tablet. So it is not published anywhere and so on, but it exists in archive of the Baha'i faith. And this is what I wanted to say a few moments ago. In principle, one thing that we should know is that the conceptions that we have of the Baha'i faith and the nature of the Baha'i community at this time is very tentative. We should never think that we know exactly what the Baha'i faith is, and that the existing institutions and forms of structures of community and so on, it's exactly as it would be in the future. We have, as Baha'i communities, we have not studied writings of the Bab, writings of Baha'u'llah, writings of Abdul-Baha. A few of them we have, but vast majority of the writings of Baha'u'llah, of Abdul-Baha, writings of the Bab, we have studied nothing almost. But vast majority of the writings of Baha'u'llah, of Abdul-Baha, we have not studied. We don't know. And for that reason, we, Baha'is in particular, also non-Baha'is, we have to be much more humble in terms of our conception of the Baha'i faith. We should not be very dogmatic and sure that this is what has happened and these are the Baha'i ideas and so on. We have to have a tentative idea and to be confident that as time goes on and we become more and more familiar with Baha'i writings, that the complexity of Baha'i message and so on becomes more available to us. So everything that we have at this time is really a tentative expression of Baha'i faith. And this was the most important message for me of spending time in Haifa, for instance, and studying the writings of Baha'u'llah. The most important implication of that for me was that I understood that I should not be so sure about every single thing about Baha'i faith we know. I mean, we know some aspects of the Baha'i faith, but a lot of that we don't. And many things that we think we know, what really those statements, those discussions means, those meanings become much more enriched and much more complex when we look at the totality of the writings. And so it's a fresh, happy, hopeful future of exploring Baha'i writings and understanding Baha'i culture and so on. Yes, for the moment. You wanted to say something?
I just had an incidental question about the language. Was it common of the writings that you have seen of Baha'u'llah from his youth or those early days, or perhaps just in general comparing to other writings from Iranian society around the same time, is it common to have Arabic be used, or was this an uncommon?
Well, the language of prayer in Islamic discourse and so on was in Arabic. I mean, the religious language was in Arabic. Actually, it was the Bab who, to a large extent, for the first time, makes a religious discourse, I mean, sacred religious discourse, makes it Persian as well. Otherwise, everything, I mean, people can talk about religion, but not as sacred works which would be perceived to be a divine work. In the Islamic culture, the idea was that these are all in Arabic. And for that reason, when the Bab talks about the modes of his revelation, he talks about 4 modes of revelation which are in Arabic, and then he adds the 5th mode of revelation, which is the Persian mode. Namely, he adds that varieties of his writings, sacred writings, now would be in the language of Persian. But ordinarily, the language of sacred writing was Arabic. But that was, of course, confined to elites of the society and the few who were educated and the like. But this, so it is not, it is in a sense usual, but this form of prayer is also very unusual. And of course, the content and the concept is absolutely unusual. There is no similar, nothing in terms of idea, in terms of concept and so on, resembling this in anything in the history of the Middle East. In 20th century, we started to partly influenced by the Baha'i faith, partly influenced by the Western ideas and so on, that these sort of ideas, for instance, rejection of slavery and so on, become part of modern discourse. But in 1839, that Baha'u'llah is writing this is absolutely a total heresy and a total novelty without precedence. Yes?
Anybody had access to that pamphlet? Anybody read it at that time? Or
We don't know really much about it, but from the content it is clear that this is written when Esfandiar is in the presence of Baha'u'llah. So he's writing this as a prayer right at the time that at least Esfandiar is present. But who knew about this, how much it was shared and so on, we have absolutely no information. The very existence of this prayer, I just discovered that last winter. And there are so many of these writings that almost no one is aware of its existence. So we need lots of particularly younger scholars that they devote themselves to learning Persian, learning Arabic, and try to engage in Baha'i studies deeply, and therefore explore increasingly these works and discover and share, elaborate, and so on. The Baha'i faith is something which is completely fresh and untouched and unexplored. Sometimes in traditional conceptions of religion that some of Baha'is sometimes share that traditional conception, the idea is that we have these particular ulama, the scholars. Previously they were akhund and keshish and so on. Now, because we don't have priesthood in Baha'i faith. But then we have the idea that we have particular scholars, that these scholars know everything and they have read everything and so on. There is no such a thing. And as I mentioned, the Baha'i faith is, as it exists right now, is completely tentative. we have to explore that. We have to begin to study that. Baha'is, non-Baha'is in various of form of research and so on. So particularly the younger generation, they should know that there is nobody to do this for them. We don't have priests. So it is ourselves who have to explore these things gradually and so on. I mean, in a sense, it is sad because we don't have familiarity with all these layers and complexities of the Baha'i faith. But at the same time, it's so delightful and happy and exciting that there's so much which is unexplored, and it's really an adventure to go and do that. Yes.
If you deem appropriate, would you please elaborate about the meeting between Hazrat Bab and Hazrat Baha'u'llah?
It is not related to this discussion, but it's one of those issues which remain ambiguous at this time. Namely, Baha'u'llah, in one of his tablets, indicates that a meeting between the Bab and Baha'u'llah in secret took place. And he says, bar hasab zahir, namely physically and in this world. And he says where it happened. And he immediately says that Qudus frequently was in the presence of Baha'u'llah. So the way Baha'u'llah talks about this is not that it is in the world of spirit and so on. It appears that he's talking about at a particular time and context that they have met. However, there are a few indications that according to Abdul Baha, he indicates that no physical meeting has taken place. So for this reason, this is one of those issues that we don't know exactly what it is, and it is ambiguous. And I believe personally that it is wrong to disregard one and take the other as the only evidence or as the only proof and so on. Maybe in the writings of Baha'u'llah, in the writings of Abdul Baha, so many writings which has not been studied, has not been explored yet, there would be more information about this. But at this moment, it is one of those ambiguous, mysterious points that, so if you ask me, my answer is that I don't know, because these two texts appear to be indicating differently. Two people that know, Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha. And so it is not very clear whether Bab and Baha'u'llah met physically or not.
There is no mention in Bab's writing?
No. Nothing that would be in any form or any shape explicit and direct. Maybe in the future, some of his texts can be looked at it from this point of view, and therefore it might have implications, but nothing directly, no. Yes?
Professor Saidi. You said that most of the tablets have not been released, basically, and you have it there. I was wondering why not, first of all, and second, is there a procedure what's the procedure to release them?
Well, actually, the reason that I was there last winter was because the House of Justice wants to make all these tablets, Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, Bab, and so on, to make them accessible to the world and the Baha'i community. So the idea is first to know what are existing. For example, what tablets exist, what topics they are discussing. When I worked on the writings of the Bab, this began with work on the writings of the Bab 5 years ago, that I was invited in Haifa, and I was doing this. At that time, there was no indexing. So I just would read the work of the Bab, and I would write a summary in English. And I liked that much more because I could read much more. And within 4 months, I did everything of the writings of the Bab which exists in Haifa. I created an inventory. And because that House of Justice was pleased with that system, they wanted to make this a much more elaborate, much more sophisticated, adding now indexing. And right now they have this plan that for each work of Baha'u'llah, at least 3 different readers would engage in this writing abstract and indexing and so on, so that it won't be perspective of one particular person. And if one makes mistakes, at least 2 other readers and so on. So on the basis of these, the idea is that to and when I was working on the writings of the Bab, one very important issue was which one of these are writings of the Bab, because it is possible that some of the works which are there assumed to be by people who have collected them and have put them together, they have assumed that this would be the work of the Bab, whereas it would be the work of somebody else. Might be the work of Baha'u'llah, might be the work of one of the major Babis, or someone else. And as a matter of fact, occasionally I found a few works which were not by the Bab, and so I indicated that this is not work of the Bab, so should be excluded. So the idea of publishing, whether in the form of online publishing or in the form of books and later translation and so on, because this is the scriptural world and so on, has to be a work which would be meticulous and make sure that the copies would be authentic and not mistaken and so on. So it's not an easy task, but it is what the House of Justice wants to do, and so this process is going on right now, and it depends how fast are those people who are engaged in this process. But many of the writings which are not published, you can find sometimes in different manuscripts or collections in different universities, and some of them have become online and so on. So it is not the case that only things which are formally published are accessible now. Many other things are also accessible. But nowhere, for example, in terms of the writings of the Bab, which I'm much more familiar with that, nowhere in the world has the rich collections of the writings of the Bab than Haifa Archive. Nowhere in the world is remotely comparable to that. So many works of the Bab, I found at least 15 works of the Bab which are above 500 pages that nobody knows they exist. Namely, when I was doing that work, I have to give them names because they have not been discussed in any literature, so they don't have a name. Nobody has talked about them and so on. So in order to make a computer file for that, I had to assign a name to this, which hopefully later on these names would change, and the names would be something which would fit the text better. But my point is that there are so many writings of the Bab that no researcher, past, present, no literature which has talked about the Bab or the writings of the Bab is aware of the existence of this text, let alone that they have read and so on. So they have no names in the literature. There are so many. Nowhere is like Haifa. And for Baha'i writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdullah, even more. I mean, that's the place. Having said that, for those who want to make research and so on, still oceans of possibilities exist in different collections, in different, some of them online, and so on. But in the future, of course, more and more would be available, more and more would be translated. That's one of the problems with the Baha'i faith. It has no one book. It has a library of sacred books, and so the challenge becomes much more complicated.
So it's authentication one of the issues, and also having I was wondering if some of these writings, I've heard that, they don't, they would be, it's better for future Baha'i community to be revealed or something. Is that true?
No, there is no such a thing. Rumors are very popular among human beings and human communities, including Baha'i community. And so lots of people say lots of things for themselves, and this one hears from that one, and that one hears from this, and suddenly it is accepted as fundamental truth or something like that. The works that has been written by Baha'u'llah, by Abdul Baha, by the Bab, they are works for humanity, and the purpose has been to have them accessible. If Baha'u'llah himself decides that some of his writings, humanity is not ready for that, and so on, he is the only person who would make a decision like that. But the writings are available. The point is that nobody at this time, it's difficult to say this, but nobody at this time really knows or has really read or is familiar with all the writings of Baha'u'llah, of Abdul Baha, and so on. It is so much, and it requires lots of work. And this is one of those stages that the Baha'i community is entering. And so, as I mentioned, future is so exciting. In terms of the idea of why not all the writings are available, sometimes people make these sort of statements. But then when you ask them, have you read works which are translated, which are published, and so on, vast majority have not read almost in any case. So many of the fundamental primary works of Baha'u'llah has been published, has been translated, but those other works which are not translated, it's not that they are not important. I shared with you one work of Baha'u'llah. This is absolutely for me, one of the most important, one of the most significant documents of Iranian history. And there are infinite numbers of these things, but the Baha'i literature and Baha'i writings and so on, as I mentioned, are not confined to one book or two books or three books and so on. So in its time and resources, and the Baha'i community also is the one who is directly involved in this. I mean, we need people who can read these things, who can work on these things, who can translate and so on. Nobody would do these things except us. And so younger generations in particular, I emphasize that it's very important that some of us, not that I would be part of the younger generation, but some of us would take this issue of devoting our life to Baha'i studies and so on seriously. Thank you very, very much for staying, and so many questions and so on shows your interest and your enthusiasm for the materials, despite the fact that it is late and it has been a long day for everybody. See you on 2 Mondays from now.